There we go. So welcome to Financial Aid 101. If you are a senior parent, your student, unless they've been in the AP Econ class this year, they have all had a presentation very similar to this in their CCR classes this week. And it's really presenting to you the basics of financial aid and for your students to get that information to make applying for financial aid easy for you and easy for your students. Okay, so my goal by the end of this presentation, I'm hoping that you will all know the types of financial aid, the meanings of all these acronyms that get thrown around when people are talking about financial aid, COA, EFC, SAR, SAR, how to complete the FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid, and also a little bit about the CSS profile, which is a financial application that some private schools that you have to complete in addition to the FAFSA. So I start off with the students asking them what they think of when they hear the term financial aid. If you look on a college website or read an article about a college, you'll often see, oh, 85% of students who go to U of O get financial aid. And so what do you think that means? What are they getting? And so a lot of students say money, scholarships, grants. Usually it's that idea of free money, right? That's the financial aid. And so then I transition over for the kids and we look at what colleges, what people who live in the financial aid world mean when they talk about financial aid. So these are the three main pathways of financial aid. Grants, so they can be federal grants like the Pell Grant or the FSEOG grant. We have state grants, the Oregon Opportunity Grant, the Oregon Promise Grant. Colleges give their own grants. U of O has the Pathway Grant, SOU has the Affordability Grant. Then there's all sorts of scholarships, which can also come from colleges. They have their own merit scholarships or diversity scholarships. We have lots of local organizations and state organizations that give a lot of scholarship money to our students. That's the free money, right? You never have to pay it back. But loans are also considered financial aid. And so when a school says that a certain percentage of its students receive financial aid, yes, a lot of those students are probably getting grants and scholarships, but a good percentage of those students are also being offered loans. That doesn't mean they're necessarily accepting those loans, but that's part of their financial aid package. And when students get their financial aid packages from colleges, those loans are put right in the financial aid along with the grants and the scholarships. And often parents, students don't read the fine print. They just see the bottom line of financial aid. Wow, I got $21,000 in financial aid and think that's the free money they're getting. And it's really important to start to be savvy about that. So when their aid applications or their aid packages start coming in, you can break it down. Oh, look, here's the Pell Grant or a partial Pell. Okay, let's highlight that. That's free money. You don't have to pay back. Oh, look, you got this diversity scholarship. There's some more money. Okay, here's a loan. We know what that is. Let's see, we might want to take it out. We might not. Let's see if we do a lot of personal finance kind of work in CCR that's coming up for students. And we talk about loans. We're all debt adverse, right? We don't want our kids to have to go into debt to go to college. Parents don't want to be in debt, but adults take out loans all the time for all sorts of things, houses, cars. Education is really important for a lot of students. And if they want to get to a certain career, getting an education is a part of that. And if taking out a loan, which the maximum for first year students, which is a surprise for some parents now who took out loans themselves, the maximum amount a freshman first year student in college can take out now is $5,500. It's a reasonable sum. And I tell students if $5,500 is standing between their dream school that's going to get them to where they think they want to go and going somewhere else, that might be a reasonable decision to make. So those are the kind of conversations we've been having in class. But a lot of parents went to college when financial aid offices were saying, hey, you can take out this loan and this loan and this loan. And that's why we have so many teachers and parents who have a lot of student debt still. And it's not like that anymore, thankfully. I'm glad our kids really can't go into debt anymore, coming out, with maybe 20, 30,000 in debt. Might sound like a lot, but it's a lot less potentially than the last generation of college students. So there's two types of categories of aid: need-based aid, right? Based on the student's financial resources, their family's financial resources. So grants like the Pell and the Oregon Opportunity Grant are need-based. Work study, which is often federally funded, is need-based. It's also some institutions provide work study money. And then there's two kinds of loans the federal government will offer. Subsidized loan, which is based on a student's need, a family's need, and unsubsidized loans, and we'll get into those later. There's also non-need-based aid. So the Oregon Promise, which is our state's grant to make community college affordable for all students, it's been around for 5 or 6 years now, is not need-based. So a family can make $100,000 a year, $1,000 a year. The state is still giving those students, last year it was $4,000 a year to pay towards their community college tuition, which is really the bulk of community college tuition. It averages around $5,000. The last couple of years, the state has put in a tentative cap for incomes for the Oregon Promise because they were worried there wouldn't be enough money, but there's always been enough money. So I tell students who community college might be an option to apply for the Oregon Promise, to put a community college on their FAFSA, which we'll get into because a lot of our students end up using that Oregon Promise money. And then of course there's non-need-based scholarships and then loans that are unsubsidized that students can take out that aren't based on need. Okay, so one of the biggies we talked about in CCR this week is cost of attendance at colleges, or COA, and I referred to it when I was talking about the college handbook and having that budget sheet. So, you know, parents think, oh, I heard tuition at U of O is $12,000. That's reasonable. We can do that. But tuition is really for our state schools and community colleges. That's the small piece of the puzzle, right? If your student's going to live on campus, dorms, meal plans at U of O, at SOU, at PSU, the room and board is more than the tuition. So it's important to take that into consideration. So these direct costs, those are costs that you're paying to the school. A lot of students don't live on campus housing, so those won't be direct costs. But again, when we talked about before we started this, how some of these costs that are reflected into the average cost of attendance you'll see online for the cost of a college or in a financial aid package will be different for your student, right? So depending if they want a single room or the meal plan where you can eat as much, you know, as often as you want, whenever you want, that's going to be more expensive versus, you know, living in an older dorm, having 2 roommates, getting a meal plan where you get, say, 15 meals a week instead of, you know, the big kahuna package. It's going to be cheaper. The indirect costs can really vary. Like I mentioned with SOU, they include that $2,000 transportation, which unless our kids in the Valley are taking a limo to school every day, it's not, that's $2,000 they're not going to spend. Of course, book costs really vary, personal expenses. So cost of attendance can be cheaper than it looks like. It can be more expensive. So say your student's applying to an East Coast school. If you look at the cost of attendance rubric that that school puts together, they might have $2,000 for travel. And if your student's flying to Boston and wants to come home at Thanksgiving, wants to come home at winter break, maybe wants to go somewhere at spring break, you're probably going to be paying, or they're going to be paying more than $2,000 a year in transportation. So those are things to be aware of. So I think I went into some of these details. Some schools' tuition can vary based on the number of credits a student's taking. So that's how it's done at the state schools that are a community college. They base your tuition on how many credits they charge you per credit. At a lot of private schools, it's you pay the same amount of tuition, whether you're taking 12 credits or 18 credits. So if you're paying $50,000 a year for your student to go to a school, you might be wanting to encourage them to take more credits because they're going to get through school faster, but maybe it's a little too stressful for them to take that many credits. These are the kind of things that, you know, come into play as you're starting to look at schools, what classes they're going to be taking, kind of seeing what's going to be a good financial fit for your family. So the do your research, I can't stress this enough. If you've been to any of my presentations, I always talk about, for students, finding a next step, what school, what career, college, educational pathway for them is about finding something that's going to be a good fit for them, right? Academically, what are their career goals, their academic goals? Culturally, socially, do they feel comfortable on that campus? Do they feel like they can find their people? But what it comes down to for our students, they get into most of the schools they apply to. Of course, those super competitive schools that have 6% acceptance rate, our kids who apply are usually really qualified to go there, but it's just kind of, hit and miss whether they get in. It's that way for all students. What it comes down to for our students is they get into their schools, but then they have to figure out what school is going to be a good financial fit for their family. So just as an example, Lewis and Clark as a private school, $70,000 plus. Every kid that applies there is going to get some kind of presidential or dean scholarship, take it down $20,000 to $25,000 potentially a year. That's super exciting. But if you don't qualify for a Pell Grant, you're still looking at $50,000, $40,000 to $50,000 a year for your kid. If they apply to U of O is about $30,000 a year cost of attendance. Now a little more if your student's in the honors college. If they get some merit aid, that could be a few $1,000s towards that. If you're Pell eligible, if they get some financial need-based aid, all of your tuition could be covered. For a lot of our families, the difference between $25,000 a year at U of O versus $50,000 a year at Lewis and Clark is a big difference, especially if you've been even if you've been saving money for college, or grandma and grandpa have a college fund. So your kids may have asked you, I tell them, you need to have this discussion with your parents if you haven't already. Students really need to know as they start this process, primarily so you parents don't end up being the dream killers in the spring. I see a lot less tears in my office since I've gotten a lot more blunt about this. When I started, parents would come in and say, I just want my kid to apply everywhere. I want them to apply to Stanford just to see if they can get in. That we'll figure out the financial part. That's a lot of work for kids. And they'd come in and saying, I wish I had known that my parents weren't willing to pay $45,000 a year for me to go to Lewis and Clark. I wouldn't have spent all the time doing the application. I'm happy to go to U of O and it's going to be a great school for me. But it's really hard to have that conversation when you've never had it in April. Better to have it now. So if your kid's dream school is Lewis and Clark, like, great, go for it. If you get one of the 5 full ride tuition scholarships and it's only going to cost us around $20 a year for room and board, we'll do that. We can do that. But if it's going to cost $40 to $50, that's going to be a stretch for our family. So we totally support you in applying, but we want you to be aware of all your options. It used to be that kids would apply to their dream schools, their reach schools, and then apply to OSU or U of O as their safe school. They didn't visit there. They had no intention of going there. And when they didn't get into their dream schools or found out their dream schools were too expensive, they wanted to take a gap year because they didn't want to go to OSU or U of O because they really hadn't seriously researched them and understood what great schools they are and the programs they had. So I really encourage you to have these conversations. If you haven't, your kids don't need to know how much money you make, whether you're in debt. They don't need to know any of that, but they need to know, hey, we love you, we support you, we can't contribute anything to your education. Or we'd be willing to take out $5,000 a year in loans, or hey, we can pull together $5,000 a year or $10,000 a year, or your grandparents have saved, they have $25,000 a year. Because I hear a lot from kids, oh, my parents have me covered, my grandparents have me covered. They said I should just go for it. It's like, that is awesome. Go tell them how grateful you are. But now we're at the time where you need to know what have me covered means. Like, do you mean like $60,000 a year Reed have me covered, or $30,000 a year U of O have me covered? Because these are the things I really need to start to understand as I'm applying. Really important. These net price calculators that slide is referring to, every college by law has to have a net price calculator on their website. That was thanks to the Obama administration. Some are better than others, but you just Google Harvard net price calculator, any school net price calculator, easiest way to find them. They don't make it super easy for you to find them if you just go to their website. And they'll ask you financial information about your family, your student's GPA, some other information sometimes, and they'll give you an idea of what it will cost to send your student to that school. Okay, I'm going to take a breath for a minute. Does anyone have any questions they want to holler out or throw in the chat? No? Okay. So all financial aid revolves around the FAFSA. First and foremost, the free application for federal student aid. Free is the most important F in there. There are some websites that will charge you to complete the FAFSA. They will you to the actual federal FAFSA application, but they're providing guidance or support. So they feel like they can charge you 25 bucks. You do not want to pay 25 bucks to submit your application. That should be free. Really important to know you cannot complete if your student is a senior. Your senior will be filling out the 2022-23 FAFSA because that is where they will start school next fall in 2022. That FAFSA application is not available on the FAFSA website until October 1st, which is why we're doing that this week. And your seniors will be in the computer labs next week, starting to work on their FAFSAs. If you got super ambitious and you got on the FAFSA website already and started the 21-22 FAFSA, no problem. You got some practice. Now, October 1st will come and you'll just go back in and help your student with their 2022-23 FAFSA. Okay, so what does FAFSA do? If you've never filled one out before, or even if you have filled one out before, it is so much more streamlined and easy than it used to be. And actually next year, they're really making it simpler, supposedly going from about 150 questions, which most of you will never have to answer 150 questions on the FAFSA, down to, I think, 36 questions. But basically what the FAFSA does and will continue to do is it is collecting demographic information about the student and the student's household and financial information about the student and the student's household. And all this information, once you enter it, the FAFSA spits out what's called the student's SAR, the student aid report, which is a summary of all the information that you and your student will enter into the FAFSA. And the really important part of that student aid report is the student's expected family contribution, or the EFC. So important, you'll see the EFC sometimes with a dollar sign in front of it. It is not a dollar amount, it is a financial strength indicator. That's one of the things they're going to change next year. They're not going to call it the EFC anymore. They're going to call it something that doesn't sound like it's an actual amount of money you have to pay. It's used in calculations like an amount of money, which makes it very confusing, but a lot of families will get their EFC like, well, we can't pay $20,000 a year. I mean, that's ridiculous. But according to the FAFSA, that's about what they think you can pay. Sometimes families make mistakes entering information on the FAFSA. They put the parent's income in the student part. So I just like to tell families that EFC is usually between 15 and 20% of the parent's income and assets, just to give you a ballpark. So if you get your student's EFC and you're like, what? You know, this seems really high. I thought we were going to be Pell eligible. So think about your income, your assets, everything you entered into the FAFSA. And if your EFC seems way off, like way more than 20% of your income and assets, contact me. We can go through your student aid report. It's like, oh, I see. Did Johnny make $70,000 in 2020? It's like, oh no, that was my income. It's like, that's why. They think that's your student's income. That it's a mistake people make for sure, or kids make, putting it in the wrong place. So next slide. Oh, I guess I should have done a little more here. So what financial and demographic information is collected by the FAFSA? So demographic information is, you know, information about the student, their age, that kind of thing. It's more demographic information about the household. That's important. So how many people live in your household? How many people are supported by this income and assets that you're going to declare? How many people in your household are in college? That makes a big difference. So when students do a FAFSA or parents do a FAFSA with their oldest child and that student gets an EFC, and then they have another student who comes along, a child a year or two later, and they're both in college at the same time, usually the EFC gets cut in half. So it really, when you have more kids or there's also a parent in college, it will really lower EFC. They also take into account the parent's age. The closer a parent is to retirement, the less they take from that parent's income and assets. Financial information that the FAFSA collects, they will want to know your tax information from 2020. The FAFSA always uses tax information from 2 years prior to the FAFSA you're filling out. So your tax information from 2020 is what will go on the FAFSA. The confusion for a lot of families is it's using 2020 tax information. But when you fill out the FAFSA, they're going to ask you questions about your life on the day you're filling out the FAFSA. So lots change in 2 years. So you may have lost a job. You may have lost a spouse. You may have gotten divorced, right? So you could have filed jointly in 2020 and now you're separated or divorced. There's lots of things that change. And I'll talk a little bit about how you deal with some of those changes in this. But if you have specific questions about these, stay after, ask me questions, email me, call me. I spend a lot of time with parents working on FAFSA and helping them kind of navigate. It's way easier when you have help doing it. I hate to see people just struggling at home, trying to figure these things out. If you want to just come in and jump on a computer or bring your computer in, I'm happy to walk through FAFSA with you, and it's really fast. So back to that financial piece, one of the things they'll ask you is about your assets. So what do you have in your savings checking accounts? They ask students this too. I tell the students they are never going to look in your bank account, right? So sometimes students have a lot of money in their bank account. They just had a birthday and grandma and grandpa gave them a check, or they just sold a computer or their car or their collection of manga or something. So they don't want to know, what's in your necessarily what's in your bank account that day. It's really important for parents who actually tend to have a lot more money in a bank account potentially. So on average, what you have in your bank account, you don't need to declare everything. Other assets like 529s or stock assets account, things that show up on your taxes, you definitely should be accurate in those. So any questions about that?
There's one in the chat. If older sibling is in college and has scholarships and parents are not paying out of pocket, does this affect the EFC?
No, I mean, it won't, they won't know that. So it's still going to look like you have 2 students in college. So it should greatly reduce each of your kids' EFC. Does that make sense? Did that answer the question? And they also, just back to the financial piece, I had a family or a parent ask me a couple years ago that their kids had different EFCs. And so their kids had different financial assets, right? They ask students sometimes, if the parent's really low income, they often don't ask the student financial question. It'll kind of, the form triggers to not even prompt the student to provide financial information. But if the parents make a certain amount of money, they will ask the student that. So if a student says, if they worked in 2020 and they made $3,000 and they put that down, that's in there. If they put down that they have $5,000 in their bank account, the FAFSA formula, I told you kind of what they look at in terms of percentage they'll take from a parent's income and assets. For students, it's higher, right? They don't think that student's supporting a household or children. So for a student, they'll take about 20% towards their EFC. They figure they can contribute 20% of what they declared is assets for them. So that's why you might see 2 of your children have somewhat different EFCs, even though the parents' income and assets are the same. Okay, so a lot of kids ask this, parents ask this. Sometimes I can't contribute anything to my students' education. My parents not going to contribute. Why do they need to be on here? This seems like a hassle. So up until the age of 24, the federal government requires that for students that are filing a FAFSA, that if they can provide parent information, they should. We have a lot of students every year who don't need to provide parent information. So there's a series of questions right at the beginning of the FAFSA that the student will have to answer. Have you ever been in foster care? Have you been homeless in the last 6 months? Are your parents deceased? Do you have a legal guardian? All of those students can file as independents. Also, students who have their own children or who are married, kids are like, what? Well, we don't see that at Ashland High School. I saw that at my old school. You have to remember, right? Not everyone who's filling out the FAFSA who's under the age of 24 is 17. There's a lot of 23, 22-year-olds who do have children who are married. They do not need to provide parent information on the FAFSA. So this is also a situation a lot of our students run into. Parents are divorced or separated. How does the FAFSA work then? So the FAFSA is asking if your parents are divorced or separated, they only want the financial resources from one of those parents' household. And they're asking for the parent that the student spends the majority of time with. For a lot of our students, if both their parents live in town or in the valley, it's kind of a back and forth thing. We don't know. It's kind of 50-50. In the summer, they're more with dad or more with mom. So for those kids, they have the ability for the parents to kind of look at the household income and assets and decide which parent makes the most sense to use on the FAFSA. And one thing to remember, if either parent has remarried their spouse or the student's step parent, their income, because they're part of that household, also has to be included. And parents will say, but my spouse isn't planning to contribute to my kids' education. They have their own kids that they have to pay for college for. Well, the FAFSA doesn't care. Maybe the new FAFSA is going to change that. I'm not sure. I haven't read the 50-page document, but for this year, that's part of it. So one way, if you're in a situation where you have your student has two households of parents, and you're not sure which family is the best household to use, this FAFSA forecaster there at the bottom, it's a tool on the FAFSA website. If you Google FAFSA forecaster, you can find it. Both parents can go ahead and do that. I want to keep track of the time so I don't go over. And kind of get a sense. It will ask you about your income, your assets, how many are in your household, the same kind of questions the FAFSA will ask, and then give you an idea of if you're your student will be Pell eligible, what kind of grants they might qualify for. So that's a really useful tool for families who are trying to figure that out. So any questions about that? Okay, so the first step, and I know from some of you here that your students came home and talked to you about this, the student and one of their parents who is going to help them fill out the FAFSA both need to get what's called an FSA ID. So the FSA ID is your electronic signature. It's like your PIN for your ATM. It's how when you submit your form, you use your FSA ID to confirm that, yes, this is me. I'm verifying that this information is true. So I'm going to have students sign up for their FSA IDs in computer labs in their CCR classes early next week. Monday and Tuesday, we'll be doing that. I really encourage you not to make your students FSA ID for them, right? Let them do it for themselves for a number of reasons. First of all, this is the information that both your student and you need to make your FSA ID. Students need to know their social security numbers. We have students who don't have social security numbers and parents that don't have social security numbers. There's total workarounds for that if you don't. So I've told students to come talk to me if that's their situation, and encourage their parents to come talk to me because we'll help with the workarounds. But for the majority of our students, they need to know their social security number. Make sure if you're a parent listening that you give them their correct social security number, not a sibling's social security number. That's happened more times than I can count. The really important thing is your student needs to know how their name reads on their social security card, because that is the name they need to enter exactly when they're filling out the FSA ID form. So we have so many students who have been using nicknames or variations of their names that's not on their social security card. I learned today this was a new one for me. I have two kids whose name are spelled wrong on their social security card. A few years ago, I had a student, we could not get his FSA ID to match. It kept getting rejected. Found out he had a really long hyphenated name. And when his parents got him a social security card, there was a limit on the number of characters that could be on the last name. So his social security card had the first last name, hyphen, and half of the second last name. And that's how he had to get his FSA ID. It has to match. So parents actually make this mistake more than students because they hear me talk about this. I'll remind them on Monday or Tuesday when they're getting their FSA IDs, but parents go and make their own FSA IDs. So parents, make sure that you enter your name when you get your FSA ID as it is on your social security card. A lot of our kids have hyphenated last names, 2 last names that aren't hyphenated. That's important too. If there's a hyphen, there needs to be a hyphen. If there's no hyphen, there shouldn't be a hyphen. If there's a junior, like we've had, you know, Tom Jr., Bobby Jr., that junior needs to be on the FSA ID application. So any questions about that? Okay, so one of the important reasons of kids doing this for themselves is the FSA ID is like their ATM pin, right? They might give you their pin, they trust you, you're not going to go drain their bank account, but the FSA ID is also what your student will use if they decide to take out a federal loan. And there have been instances, I've heard this from financial aid officers, where students think they have gone to school with no loans, and their parents have used the student FSA ID to take out student loans. And you know, it's one thing if parents and students are having that conversation, like, yeah, we think it makes sense for you to take out a student loan, but your kid needs to know that. Do not take out student loans with their FSA ID for them. I don't think any of you would do that, but it happens. This is also very important and probably more important, and I'm not suggesting this to your kids, right? Some parents will ask their kids to, you make my FSA ID for me. Here's my social security number. I have lots of parents who do that because their kids are super competent and parents are busy, right? Oh, you made an FSA ID for yourself, here, make mine. Your student, if they know your FSA ID, can take out a Parent Plus loan for themselves with your FSA ID. You don't want them to do that. I don't think any kids would do that, but just take the whole FSA ID seriously, right? And it's one of those kind of adulting things. Some kids don't know their social security numbers yet. They're not working. This is a good opportunity for them to learn it, put it somewhere secure in their phone so they'll know it. Is there another question, Glenna, in the chat? Are you there, Glenna? Let's see. Oh, where do we find FSA ID from a FAFSA of 2 years ago? Excellent question. So you have an older kid, you made an FSA ID, you've forgotten your password. So the FSA ID, the username, is your email or cell phone number. So when you make an FSA ID for parents who don't have one, they're going to ask you to enter your email address. Well, they'll ask you to make a username, but you'll never have to use the username, because once you verify an email and your cell phone, which I encourage you to do, if you ever forget your password, they'll just send you a reset message to your cell phone or to your email. So if you're a parent who made an FSA ID, forgot your password, just go to that FSA ID website and click on Manage My Account. Type in the email or cell phone that you used a couple of years ago. I really like cell phone because most people don't switch cell phone numbers. Some people use a bunch of different email addresses. Often students will type in an email address, it won't work, or a parent won't work, and then I finally have them type in their cell phone and that works. And then you just say forgot password and they'll send you a reset. Okay, so why do we encourage students to file and parents the FAFSA as early as possible? Your student by mid next week, unless they're in AP Econ, because I won't get them till later in the week, they will have their part of the FAFSA done. And they will come home to you, I hope, and say, hey, I got my part of the FAFSA done. I really want to get it submitted. Can you hop on this weekend and do your part? And a lot of parents do that and it's great and it's done. A lot of parents say, I'm busy this weekend, and they are, let's do it next weekend. It kind of drags on and they get it done eventually. Here are the reasons to get it done sooner than later. One, as I mentioned earlier, once you have it done, you will know your student's EFC. You'll know if your student's going to qualify for a Pell Grant. You know what potentially, when you're doing a net price calculator and they ask you potentially what your student's EFC is, what it is. You can just type that in. We got another question. Cool, good question. Once my daughter fills out her part of the FAFSA, how do I link up to her part? I will answer that in 1 minute. Okay, So the other reason to fill out the FAFSA earlier than later, part of the FAFSA is students put the schools they're applying to on there. They don't have to put all the schools they're going to apply to because it's October. A lot of students don't have a definitive list of schools. They just need to put some. Later, they can go back after they've submitted their FAFSA and add schools. But the sooner a school gets a student's application, a student's FAFSA information, the sooner that student is in line to have their financial aid package bundled. The sooner, if a student is Pell eligible, they'll get whatever Pell Grant, but if they're Pell eligible, they might not get an FSEOG grant. That's a pool of money that potentially runs out. Work study money is a limited pool of money that runs out. Even merit aid starts to sometimes, the earlier you get in, the more merit aid you might get. So a school like U of O, OSU, they have rolling admissions. If that's a school students know they want to apply to, apply early, apply now. They might as well do it, get their FAFSA in. I've been seeing the last number of years as our students have been completing their FAFSA earlier, applying to college earlier, they're getting more of the grant money and work study that runs out as the year progresses. Okay, so that question, how do I access my students' FAFSA once they've done their part? Awesome question. Thank you for asking that. So the way you do that, there's two ways when you log on to the FAFSA website. It will say, are you the student or are you the parent? When you click I am the student, it will ask for the student's FSA ID information and the student logs in that way. A parent can log in using the student's social security number and also access it. I really suggest you always log in through your student's FSA ID with them there, if possible. It just is a little more seamless. You're actually in the right spot. The student can help guide you with the information they've learned, but you can also log in with their social security number. But once you get in there, it's going to ask you for a save key, which you will need to get from your student if they're not sitting there with you. It's another layer of password within the FAFSA where if you get up and walk away from the computer, it shuts the screen right away. So if someone's like luring over your computer at a coffee shop, they don't see your FAFSA information. It's just a 4-digit code, but they will want your student's save key if you get in using their social security number. Okay, so I think we've covered most of this except this bottom, which I've highlighted in green, super important. So when you log on and you're at the parent section of the FAFSA, it will ask the parent's marital status. If the parent's married, it will ask for the social security number of both of the parents. If the parent's divorced or widowed, it only asks for one of the parents. Then you will get to the financial section and they're going to ask for financial information from your taxes from 2020, and they will ask you if you want to use the IRS data retrieval tool, which is super helpful. If you filled out a FAFSA a few years ago, you wouldn't have had access to this. It used to be that you had no choice but to hand enter all the information from your taxes that FAFSA is looking for. Now, parents can use their FSA ID to link to the IRS website, and then the IRS auto-populates the FAFSA form with all your tax information. It's secure, you can't see it, it's protected, very secure. Like, I think this is a kind of a little bit of a paranoid senior class. It's the first time I've gotten these questions in a while. Maybe they've been on the internet a lot the last couple of years. I used to get this question all the time when I worked in the Illinois Valley. I lived there for 25 years. Like, I'm not giving the government my information. I'm not using my social security, putting it on the internet. I want to fill out a hard copy paper form and mail it. Well, that's way less secure than going on a secure government website. Most of these parents file taxes, so the government already has all this information. So I'm getting a lot of it this year. It's really interesting. I actually had a student who said they don't want any money from the government. So even if they qualify for that $4,000 Oregon Promise, they don't want it. So they're not filling out the FAFSA. Okay, I've never heard that one before. I mean, I've had parents who don't like the government, don't want to do the FAFSA. But when I tell them, hey, this isn't about you. This is about your kid getting money from the government to go to school. and they want to go to school. I have had parents say, I think school is a waste of time, college education. I don't want them to be one of those snooty college people. But most parents are like, oh, I didn't realize that. Like, you mean the government's going to give my kid $10,000 a year to go to community college, and that's only $5,000 a year, and they're going to get that money back to live on? And oh, okay, yeah, I'll do this now. But the reason I really encourage you to use the data retrieval tool, you can type in that information, but if you use the data retrieval tool, colleges know that your information is accurate, right? It's coming from the IRS. They've verified it. So you're way less likely to be selected for verification by the colleges where you have to submit actual scanned copies of your tax returns, which is a hassle. Please try to use the IRS data retrieval tool. Sometimes you can't, it doesn't work for some reason. If that's an issue, sometimes it won't work because you've tried to use it too soon after you got your FSA ID. Sometimes you have to wait 48 hours or so for them to verify who you are, because they don't want just any Joe Blow accessing your tax information and using it on somebody's FAFSA. If it's not working for you, reach out to me. I can try to troubleshoot that. The main mistake parents make is it asks for your address. And you need to use the address where you were living when you filed your 2020 taxes. For a lot of families who have lived in the same place, that's not an issue, but for parents or families that have moved some, that's one thing to look out for. So any questions about that? So I think I've covered most of the first bullet points on here, and I want to kind of get to the end because we're getting close to 6:30. The last bullet point about the selective service, this is one of the interesting discussions we've been having in CCR. I didn't honestly know until I started working on the FAFSA 15 years ago with students that it is the law in the United States that students, well, males, when they turn 18 are required by law to register with the selective service. I'm not going to have to explain to all of you what the selective service is. Some students think when you mention draft that are we talking football? Are we talking, like they really don't, they don't know about military drafts, but a lot of them do. So the selective service, right, is where people were drafted from, men were drafted from. We haven't had a draft in this country for many, many years. We clearly have a very robust voluntary military source in this country, but we still have a selective service. And supposedly, if a male student doesn't register at the age of 18, they could be fined or go to jail. I've never heard of that happening. The reason it's on the FAFSA is because students cannot get federal financial aid, the Pell Grant, any of the federal aid. They can't take out a federal loan if they have not registered for the selective service. You also, I learned when I went down the selective service rabbit hole, because I had to learn all about this because I became the designated person to inform all of our students, since supposedly we're required by law to do that as well as a public school. You can't work for the federal government. You can't work for the Forest Service. If your dream is to be an FBI agent or work at an embassy or any other of all the amazing federal organizations in this country, if you get to the age of 28 or there's a window to register for the selective service for males. I think it's like 18 to 26 or 27. If a male in this country, and this could change in the next 10 years, but it hasn't, gets to the age of 28 and decides they do want to go to college, they do want to do the FAFSA, or oh my God, there's this amazing Forest Service job. If they never registered for the selective service within that window of time, those avenues are closed to them. I mean, and the selective service is serious about this. They have directions for financial aid offices at colleges that says, hey, if a student, over that age comes to you and says, hey, I didn't know it was a law. No one ever told me I needed to register for the selective service. They basically say in the selective service on their website, someone in this country would have to be living under a rock not to know that. Well, I guess that was me. I even watch TV, like a lot of sports with my husband. Like I see a lot of commercials for the military, but I've never seen one that says, hey, all you young men out there watching this and their parents, this is our law in our country. It's a little frustrating to me. But back to the FAFSA. This is another issue that comes up for students. One of the first questions on the FAFSA is, what's your gender? And unlike pretty much every other application your student fills out these days, especially in Oregon, you have lots of options of what your gender is. You don't have to answer sometimes, but you have options. On the FAFSA, there's 2 options, the ones you're thinking, male and female. So that's really upsetting for a lot of our students. It gets really basic. They want to know what's on your birth certificate. So if you want to fill out the FAFSA, you put the gender that is on your birth certificate. If your birth certificate's been adjusted to reflect your true gender identity, great. Put what's on your new birth certificate. It doesn't have to be on your original birth certificate. But once students click male, it triggers the selective service question. If a student clicks female, they never see this question. So a lot of kids are like, well, why don't, females have to do this? The Selective Service also makes this clear on their website. They would love females to register for the Selective Service, but that takes an act of Congress, and that's never been a priority for Congress to make happen. So that's kind of where we are. I talk to kids about weighing the pros and cons. I honestly don't think we will ever have a draft again in this country, but a lot of things have happened that I honestly thought we would never see. But the Selective Service is very clear on their website. There are lots of ways to not serve if we ever did have a draft. And most of you know lots of ways that were used during the Vietnam War. So it's really a pro-con discussion that families need to have. Often parents are more upset about this than the students. So I encourage students to reach out to me to talk about any of these issues, both the gender question on the FAFSA and the Selective Service. And if you want to have a conversation with me about it, or any other parents, I encourage you to reach out to me. And I have heard with the new revised FAFSA next year that question is actually going away. And so I need to start researching that to find out if it's no longer going to be the law, or it's just not going to be required to receive federal aid, which would be awesome, I think. And I could get rid of this part of my presentation. So it'll be a lot shorter. So this slide, after that conversation, I tell the kids, great, now we get to talk about all the money that's available to you. And so it kind of breaks down grants between federal grants, state grants, and then institutional grants. I use SOU as an example. So the federal grants, we talked about when you complete the FAFSA and submit it, based on your EFC, the federal government will tell you if you qualify for their Pell Grant. So when it comes to college education in this country, professional career school, if you get a 0 on your EFC, that's the best possible outcome. A 0 EFC means you're going to get the maximum Pell Grant, which last year was around $6,400. That money doesn't run out. So even if your student hems and haws and doesn't get their FAFSA done until later in the school year and they apply, and they're qualified for a Pell Grant, they will still get it. Some students have EFCs that make them Pell eligible. So they don't have a 0 EFC, but they have a 2,000 or a 3,000 or a 4,000 EFC. Usually the cutoff for Pell Grants for EFC is in the 5,500 range. Just to give you an idea, you will know it's usually automatic when a student finishes the FAFSA. It tells you what your EFC is. If a student's eligible for a Pell Grant, how much of a Pell Grant they're eligible for, and what student loans they're eligible for. Sometimes if a parent's assets are a little more complicated, it might take a little more time for FAFSA or whoever and the computers behind the big machine to calculate what the student's EFC will be. This Federal Supplemental Education Opportunity Grant I mentioned, that's another pot of money for Pell eligible students that does run out, and that I have seen our students getting more of those grants because they're applying earlier. So once a student submits their FAFSA, the federal government not only sends their information to the schools they list on their FAFSA, but they also send their information to the state of Oregon, specifically to the Oregon Office of Student Access and Completion, which oversees the Oregon Opportunity Grant and the Oregon Promise Grant. So the Oregon Opportunity Grant, if a student qualifies for a Pell Grant, they will also qualify for an Oregon Opportunity Grant. They have diversified that a little. It used to be the same amount, whether you went to a community college or to a four-year public or private university. Now the amount is a little lower if you're going to community college, which makes sense because community colleges cost less. So you can see kind of the variation. It usually goes up about $100 every year. I think the top 4-year last year was more like $3,600. That money can run out. It has not run out the last number of years. When the Oregon Opportunity Grant first started, if students didn't apply within the first month or so after FAFSA went live, that money was gone and they didn't qualify for it. And that was really sad, but I think it's been much more well-funded the last number of years. So the Oregon Promise Grant is our state's grant to make community college affordable for all students. I mentioned earlier, there has been no financial cap for the Oregon Promise to qualify. So that 1,000 to 4,000 range, if a student's EFC is 0, they get the full 6,000 Pell, they get the full almost 3,000 Oregon Opportunity Grant. We're talking $9,000 there. They're going to go to a community college. They throw another $1,000 on top of that, right? So that's $10,000 to go to a community college. So that student's going to be getting a bunch of money back to live on, to pay for dorms or their apartment or to save, whatever they need, right? If a student's income is higher, so the family's more middle income, their EFC is 20,000, their EFC is 30,000 or 50,000, the state is still going to give that student $4,000 to go to a community college. Last year, they set a tentative EFC cap, I think of 24,000 or 26,000. So still a relatively high EFC, right? A family's going to be making over $100,000 to have an EFC that high. But then they wiped out the tentative cap because they realized they had enough money to give to all of the Oregon students who applied for the Oregon Promise. So you're going to hear your kid, you know, who's like, no way, I'm not going to community college. I'm going to a 4-year, I'm doing this. I'm going to have them apply for the Oregon Promise. It takes 5 minutes online. They can do that next week too, when we're in labs working on the FAFSA. I'm going to strongly encourage them, I can't force them to put a community college on their FAFSA. So when you're working with them on FAFSA, if they don't have a community college on their list of schools, you might want to say, hey, why don't you just throw RCC, PCC on there? It doesn't have to be a community college they end up going to, just a community college needs to be on there. You know, we've seen if you have older kids, when COVID hit in the spring of 2020, we had a lot of students planning to go to 4-year schools, private 4-year schools that they were planning to spend a lot of money to go to. It didn't feel right to them to do online school from home and pay $50,000 for the year. So a lot of them were super glad they had done that Oregon Promise application. They had put a community college on their FAFSA because they took advantage of that $4,000 and took RCC classes online or Lane classes online. You could take any school's classes online, we've learned during COVID. I've had kids, one of the things with the Oregon Promise is you have to start within 6 months of graduation. So for community colleges, that means the end of September. And a lot of students are like, I'm not going to school next year. I need a break. I'm going to travel. I'm going to work, whatever. That's awesome. I totally honor that. But when they see that they're going to get $10,000 potentially to go to school, they're thinking, well, you know, maybe I can take some classes. So to take advantage of the Oregon Promise, a student doesn't need to go full-time. They can go part-time, right? So they can take 2 online classes from RCC, be in Costa Rica surfing. This is for the student who's pretty good at organizing their lives and staying on top of things, right? And a lot of our kids now have experience with doing online school. So I have confidence some of our kids are going to be really better prepared to navigate the online component of college classes. Even when college classes are in person, there's lots of colleges use Canvas. My daughter's college uses Canvas. She submits her papers on campus. Her syllabus is on Canvas. So anyway, that's just one of the kind of nifty things about the Oregon Promise potentially that I like to point out. With online school, you can do, you know, college from anywhere. So institutional grants like SOU, you can see they have what's called their affordability grants that are need-based. I mentioned U of O has the Pathway Grant. PSU has their 4-year tuition free. If a student is Pell eligible, they don't have to have a 0 EFC, but are just Pell eligible. Both U of O and PSU have these programs where they will cover all of a student's tuition. It's a great opportunity for U of O. You have to start as a freshman, first-year student to get the PSU. You can transfer in, so they do offer it to transfers. U of O, you have to have a minimum GPA of 3.4. PSU's was a 3.2. It went down last year because, like a lot of colleges, they were really suffering from enrollment being down and were really doing anything they could to recruit students. So I've been telling kids this is a great time to apply to college. They have big pots of money that have been sitting there because a lot of students didn't want to do online school. They've been working or doing other things. So it's a really good time to apply to school and potentially get some good funds. Any questions about that? And we already talked a little bit about work study. On the FAFSA, there is a work study question. I encourage all students to click yes, I want to be considered for work study. They might not be eligible, their income might be too high, but a lot of colleges, there's federal money that pays for work study, but a lot of colleges also have institutional money that they offer students for work study. So you might not be Pell eligible, but your student might go to a school where there's institutional money and they could offer them work study. Again, like I said, that pot of money runs out. So if a student applies late, they might not get any work study money. The cool thing is, and you all might know this, work study jobs on campus can be in a library, in an office. One of the CCR teachers worked in the ceramic studio, which she loved. And when you're doing an on-campus job, campus staff knows that your priority is being a student. So they're often much more flexible with students in terms of, oh, okay, you're feeling super overwhelmed. You have this big final coming up. Yeah, we'll let you switch shifts next week. Way more flexible often than an off-campus job where they're not as concerned about your academic life. Another great thing is when students get their financial aid package in the spring, say they know they're going to go to U of O, they've got $3,000 offered to them in work study, they can get on the jobs part of the U of O website and find a work study job, start applying for jobs. So by the time they get to campus in the fall, they've already got a job. And that's really fun to do with students in the spring and summer. Okay, and we already talked about loans, and I'm going to kind of speed through this since it's past 6:30. But again, I mentioned that $5,500 in student loans is the max. The subsidized and unsubsidized, I tell students to really look to see if they've been offered a subsidized loan. That is definitely the best one because it doesn't start accruing interest until they graduate or stop going to school for a certain amount of time. So if a student wants to take out a loan, but maybe doesn't need the full $5,500, maybe they just take out the subsidized loan. I've seen students like accepting loans by accident the last couple of years since so much is online. So you want to make sure when your students looking at their financial aid package and their student portal, and they really understand, like they get the Pell Grant, if they get a scholarship based on their GPA, they don't have to accept those, they just get those. But sometimes students are like, accept. Wait, you didn't need a loan. We didn't want you to take a loan. So that's why I try to get this information out early. And then this is fun for parents. A lot of schools, they've got their cost of attendance, right? It's like, so say next year U of O's cost of attendance is $30,000 and your EFC is $10,000, right? So they're going to offer, and you've got a great student, so they get a $4,000 summit scholarship. So you're going to see they're going to offer your student the summit scholarship, and then to get you to the $30,000 of their cost of attendance, and not all schools do this, and U of O might not do it this year, but this is their pattern. They will offer your student their $5,500 in student loans if they think your student needs it. Like if your EFC is $70,000, they're probably not going to offer your student a student loan. But if you want your kid to take out a loan because you want them to have skin in the game, I've heard that from a lot of parents, you just call the financial aid office and said, hey, we want that student loan added to the financial aid package, and they will add it. They just will say, oh, we didn't think you needed it, so we didn't put it on there. But after that, so you've got your student's $4,000 scholarship. They give them the $5,500. Your EFC is $10,000, so they think you can afford $10,000. Whatever's the difference between that cost of attendance of $30,000, U of O will give you a Parent Plus or direct loan if you qualify. They'll do a credit check on you. They have your social security number. Probably FAFSA tells them whether you qualify. So then that'll be bundled in there like, oh, and here, parent, if you want, you can take out this loan. So sometimes, parents do take out loans for their students. The Parent Plus is a federal loan. The interest rate, can be relatively good compared to private loans. I've heard from a lot of parents, often their banks offer better loans. So if you are going to take out loans as a parent, you might want to shop around on that, talk to your financial advisor, accountant, but just be aware of that, because parents are like, I had a parent say to me last year, well, where's this 18,000 going to come from? Because it was Lewis and Clark, and they don't just automatically dole out a parent loan, or maybe this parent didn't qualify. It's like, that 18,000 is supposed to come from you or your student. Like, well, how are we supposed to come up with that? Like, exactly. That's why I want students to have other options. So no, students can't take out $18,000 loans. And if you find someone that will give a student an $18,000 loan without a parent co-signing on it, I'd be super scared. Because I've had parents say, I heard students can't take out foreign loans. Like, great, go for it. It's your family, it's your kid, but I wouldn't do it. Okay, and last up, the CSS profile. So that's the other financial aid application that some private schools ask for in addition to the FAFSA. It's not free. It's housed by the College Board, SATs, AP exams. Nothing's free when you go to the College Board unless you qualify for free or reduced lunch, which if your student does, great. If they haven't already gotten a fee waiver to take the SAT, have them come see me or Karen Baratz, our office secretary, and get a fee waiver so they don't have to pay to complete the CSS profile and then pay again every time they send it to a school they're applying to. So the CSS profile just asks for a whole lot more financial information from families. For parents who are in the same household and all their information is already together on the FAFSA, the CSS profile might not be that different. It is vastly different for parents who are divorced or separated, because the CSS profile will ask for financial information from the parent that is not on the FAFSA. Now, if this applies to your family, a lot of parents get nervous, like, well, I don't want, my ex to see my information and vice versa. No worries, it doesn't all show up. They call it the non-custodial parent, which I wish they would stop, because who's on the FAFSA has nothing to do with custody. But so the other parent who's not on the FAFSA gets invited somehow, logs on, gets the student's information, and completes their part of financial information. So parents usually have questions on the CSS profile. It can be annoying. If you have questions, totally reach out to me. I'm happy to answer them or help you find the answers. There's an FAQ page on the CSS profile website or part of the College Board that's, I swear, thousands of questions. It's a rabbit hole. They have every question anyone's ever asked. Very informative. Like, my grandmother left me jewelry and it's worth this. And oh my gosh, why are you even telling them? But it's on there. And then the whole process, like the circle of life, financial aid really kind of repeats every year your student is in school. So you file the FAFSA again. If the school wants the CSS profile again, you do that. Your student applies for scholarships. So sometimes if you do not qualify for need-based aid, right? Your student's not Pell eligible, or they go to a school that does meet financial need, but you're not really getting financial aid from that school, they will say, no, you don't need to file the FAFSA again. Or like for my daughter who's at a private school in Boulder, I filled out the FAFSA the first year. She got a $15,000 merit aid scholarship. Great, we were super excited. The second year she went there, they told me I didn't need to fill out the FAFSA anymore because it was merit-based and we weren't going to qualify for need-based aid. They gave her scholarship. Great, I didn't have to spend any time doing the FAFSA. The third year she got her financial aid package and her scholarship wasn't on there. So I called and they said, oh, well, we changed. I emailed, I think we changed our policy. Now we ask that even when you're doing merit aid that you submit the FAFSA, but we're gonna grandparent you in because your student started in 2017. Like, great, thanks. I still don't have to do the FAFSA. And then this year, her senior year, wasn't there again. I thought I just have to remind them we're grandparented in, but they said, oh no, now for real, you have to do the FAFSA. So in August, I jumped on, did my kids' FAFSA. Luckily, I wasn't stressed about it because I do it all the time with other people. And then they gave her merit aid, which I tell kids, because a lot of parents will say, no, we're not doing the FAFSA. You're not going to qualify for any aid because we make way too much money. All students, senior students planning on going to some form of education after high school, parents should complete the FAFSA, right? They might use the Oregon Promise. There's no income cap. The school might want it, require it to give any kind of merit-based aid. If you are a millionaire and your kid is applying to competitive schools, most of these schools are not need blind. They need students who can pay the full amount. And, it's, a lot of students feel like it's unfair, and they do accept a lot of students who they give a lot of need-based aid to, but a lot of these private colleges say right out, yeah, the last 30% of the students we accept are students we know are full pay. So if you make a ton of money and your student's applying to those kind of schools and you're willing to dole out that kind of money for your student to go to that school, it's only going to benefit your student for you to complete the FAFSA and the CSS profile. And the last thing I'll say on the CSS profile before I stop the recording is if your student applies to private schools and the colleges are contacting you and saying, we don't really understand this part of the CSS, what you put here about this rental property you have, or, we need you to submit this document, and you'll like, really, I have to do more. Don't get frustrated. If they care enough about your kid's CSS profile, that means your kid is a good candidate for their school. They wouldn't be wasting staff time contacting you for more information, seriously considering your student as a candidate. So just keep that in mind as you frustratingly go to dig up that form or this. Another thing to know is that colleges will treat your financial aid differently. So your kid might apply to Wellesley and Amherst, and they consider that you get vastly different financial aid packages, even though both schools say they're going to meet your financial need, which means if your EFC is 20,000, they're going to offer you enough institutional aid and maybe a loan for your student so that your family does not have to pay more than 10 or 20,000. That's why it's cheaper for some of our students to go to a no loan school like Amherst or Harvard or Princeton or Reed. While Reed, it meets financial need, they're not no loan, than to go to U of O. It worked that way for my family. Some of you have heard me say this. My nephew and niece who grew up here, nephew went to Amherst, $5,000 a year out of pocket. My niece went to U of O honors, great education as well, but it costs more for the family to send her there. So I really encourage kids to apply to these competitive schools that have these huge endowments, because it definitely can be cheaper. So with that, I'm going to end the actual recorded presentation and stop the recording.